Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. In the previous lecture, we continued our examination of the process of America's increasing involvement in Vietnam in the mid-1960s, which I've described as sliding into the abyss. In this lecture, we'll continue examining that process and look more closely at what it looked like and felt like for American soldiers on the ground. One of the challenges confronting Lyndon Johnson and Westmoreland as the numbers of American troops in Vietnam increased was that it was very difficult to judge their progress in the war and determine whether they were succeeding or not in meeting their goals. There were several problems that made this war more difficult than others in that realm. One of the most important, as I've described already, is that the enemy was hard to define. At times, the enemy was described as communism. Sometimes it was the Chinese, sometimes the North Vietnamese, or South Vietnamese guerrillas, and sometimes it was all of the above. This made it difficult to set clear goals and objectives, and thus determine when those goals were being met. It wasn't even always clear who the enemy was. Second, it was also hard to maintain the morale on the home front. And the longer this process and war dragged on, the harder it became. The American people were not prepared for such a long engagement with no clear signs of success. It was also a challenge for Johnson to know just how aggressively to wage this war. Johnson didn't want to lose Vietnam. It was political death for Truman after he lost China. But he couldn't wage a total war either, for fear of inspiring the involvement of the Chinese, or worse, the Soviets themselves. And so he found himself walking this middle line between waging the war aggressively enough to win without invoking the involvement of those other greater powers. There was also, as I've discussed at some length already, the failure to secure any kind of political victory in South Vietnam. The ultimate purpose of this war was to establish a secure, non-communist government in South Vietnam. They were never able to do this. It was also difficult to know and to explain what victory even meant in this war. What was victory in Vietnam? It was not the destruction of the enemy, as had been the case in the past. For Westmoreland, victory would mean convincing the enemy that they could not prevail, and forcing them to quit. As we now know, this enemy was simply never going to quit. Their entire history was based on fighting off outside invaders like the United States. So victory, as Westmoreland described it, meant, quote, demonstrating to the VC that they cannot win. And of course we now know that was just never going to happen. On a similar point, there was the process of using this war as a political objective on the home front, escalation as a ploy to get the North to negotiate. As Henry Cabot Lodge said in 1964, "What we're interested in here is not destroying Ho Chi Minh, but getting him to change his behavior." With all of these other things taken into account, it thereby became difficult to determine success. How do we measure success or failure? It's not the taking and holding of territory as in previous wars like World War II. The measuring stick came to be a complex guessing game of how many casualties each side sustained versus their ability to replace those troops. We'll talk in a little bit later about body counts as a method for determining success, and there were many flaws in that method. With all of these challenges in mind, Westmoreland drew up a strategy in 3 stages that would guide American involvement until 1968, and in some ways even beyond. Stage 1 was to secure and stabilize the situation and establish an infrastructure to support a large modern army, building bases, building roads, bridges, and so on, so that the massive American army could move around in the countryside. Stage 2, which began in roughly late 1966, was to establish fortified bases in South Vietnam and then expand operations out from those bases. This became the search and destroy process, which we're going to talk much more about. And finally, in stage 3, this would mean that victory was approaching. This was the process of Vietnamization, to leave the war in the hands of the South Vietnamese troops themselves, so the ARVN troops could take over the war, killing off any remaining enemy troops and maintaining security in their own country. This would ultimately allow the Americans to leave and leave whatever conflict remained in the hands of the South Vietnamese themselves. As we will see, stage 1 of this process was the most successful. Building an infrastructure to wage a large war, the Americans were largely successful in that regard. Stage 2 and 3 were less so, and we're going to talk much more about both of those going forward, and we'll see what successes there might have been, but also many failures. Under this three-pronged strategy, Westmoreland was convinced that the United States would win a war of attrition, and that North Vietnam would crack first. As he said, "We'll just go on bleeding them until Hanoi wakes up to the fact that they have bled their country to the point of national disaster for generations." There was a deep, unwavering belief in the superiority of American technology. Defeat became unthinkable. Superior technology must inevitably produce victory. By that logic, it was pointless to try to learn anything about the Vietnamese history or culture. It was all irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was firepower. The first major battle involving American troops against the main force of the Viet Cong was Operation Starlight. On August 18, 1965, 2 Marine battalions flew into battle on the Batangan Peninsula against the 1st Viet Cong Regiment. Fighting was heavy, and more than 6,000 Marines participated. They called in artillery, bombing runs, and naval bombardment. When it was over, the United States claimed 573 Viet Cong killed, compared with 46 dead Marines and 204 wounded. After this battle, Westmoreland was even more confident in his strategy and convinced that the enemy could not hold out further under that kind of attack. But Lyndon Johnson continued to restrain Westmoreland. Westmoreland wanted to attack in Cambodia and Laos and to go north of the 17th parallel. Johnson told him to contain the attacks to the south. Westmoreland wanted to mine Haiphong Harbor. Johnson vetoed that plan. Westmoreland really didn't understand his enemy. He didn't have a clear grasp on what it would take to defeat them, and he didn't like fighting a limited war with considerable restraints from home. Westmoreland thus was constantly pressing Johnson for more troops and more freedom to fight his kind of war. At the same time, Westmoreland vetoed proposals from his associates to engage in a more measured sort of war, realistic for the men and machinery at his disposal. Most notably, he vetoed a proposal by Victor Krulak to have the Marines engage in dual operations with the South Vietnamese in what he called CAPs, Combined Action Platoons. These would provide security, while pacification programs installing health, education, economic development, and land reform would win the political battle in the South. Westmoreland vetoed that plan in favor of more extensive military actions. From their side, the North Vietnamese had a much clearer objective: keep fighting until the United States left, then consolidate with South Vietnam into one nation. Ho Chi Minh, correctly, was certain that South Vietnam would never unite behind the Americans or their candidates, and he was certain that the United States would lose its will to fight before North Vietnam would. Von Nguyen Giap was also shocked at the American strategy and method. In 1969, looking back on the first few years of the war, he said, "The United States has a strategy based on arithmetic. They question the computers, add and subtract, extract square roots, and then go into action. But arithmetical strategy doesn't work here. If it did, they'd already have exterminated us. When a whole people rises up, nothing can be done. This confidence in his national will led Ho Chi Minh to estimate that North Vietnam and South Vietnamese recruits could add 250,000 to 300,000 troops every year. For the United States to win a war of attrition, they would have to destroy at least that many. Still, the North Vietnamese strategy was not without its mistakes. In 1965, one of their most influential leaders of the Viet Cong, Nguyen Chi Thanh, controlled the Viet Cong effort in South Vietnam. Thanh argued that the North Vietnamese should engage the United States in major conventional battles before American firepower reached its peak. Thanh looked at the Battle of the Batangan Peninsula in August 1965 as a success. He pointed out that the United States had withdrawn from the peninsula and that it was back in Viet Cong hands. With that in mind, Thanh initiated the Battle of the Ya Drang Valley. Late in October 1965, North Vietnamese troops attacked a U.S. Special Forces camp at Plei My. Westmoreland sent in the 1st Air Cavalry Division. As 400 American troops went through what they thought was unoccupied territory in the Ya Drang Valley, the North Vietnamese attacked. After 4 days of heavy fighting, the enemy withdrew. American firepower buried the enemy under nearly 35,000 artillery rounds, 7,000 rounds of rockets, and 50,000 helicopter sorties and B-52 bomber runs. Nearly 1,800 North Vietnamese were confirmed dead, with perhaps an equal number near death. About 240 Americans were killed. This is the battle recounted in the very successful book and movie, We Were Soldiers. For both sides, this battle changed the nature of the war. In Hanoi, Than's argument in favor of major engagements was overturned. In favor of Van Nguyen Giap's strategy, more of hit and run in favorable conditions. Giap called it clinging to the belt, attacking American troops under heavy cover in the jungles, and staying so close to them that the Americans would have to call in air attacks virtually on themselves. Ho Chi Minh and Giap realized that time, not big battles, would be the key to Vietnamese victory. From July to September 1965, the United States inflicted death on the enemy at a rate of about 40 to 1, unacceptable even for the North Vietnamese. So they became more cautious, dragging out the war of attrition. In our next lecture, we'll continue this discussion of combat conditions on both sides, including the growing numbers of women for the Americans in the war.